what the second book, the book about asset managers, does is very closely linked to the first book. And what I mean by that is that when I was doing the research into the first book, one thing that became increasingly apparent to me while I did that research, but which I didn't explicitly address in the Rentier Capitalism book, was that I kept coming across this particular set of actors, a particular type or category of rentier corporation, which was asset managers. So when I was looking at the UK and when I was looking at the question of, who owns the land and property and earns the rents from it, who owns the financial assets, who owns the infrastructures that English and Welsh households depend upon for the delivery of their water, for the delivery of their energy, who owns the transportation networks and so on. I kept coming back to these actors that I was not particularly familiar with, which were asset management institutions. And I kept coming back to a particular group of them, not least the Australian asset management firm, Macquarie, again, who I was not particularly familiar with before. And so they kind of put this seed in my head. And that's how the second book came about, which was, look, I want to actually spend some time now focusing not on rentier capitalism in its totality, but focusing on this particular group of what seemed to be very, very influential and very, very powerful rentier institutions, asset managers. Now, so what that second book focuses on, the Our Lives in Their Portfolios book, is a very important phenomenon. And that phenomenon is essentially the growing control by asset managers like Macquarie, but also the likes of Blackstone that many people will have heard of, and a Canadian firm called Brookfield Asset Management, another big asset management firm. The growing control by these types of asset managers of essentially the physical things, the physical systems in which our daily lives are basically embedded. And I focus in particular on two types. The first of those is housing of various different forms. So that can be apartments, it can be detached houses, it can be student housing, it can be care homes, it can even, in the US case, be mobile home communities. So housing on the one hand, and then various forms of essential infrastructure on the other hand. So energy infrastructures, transportation infrastructures, telecommunication infrastructures, water and wastewater infrastructures, and then also social infrastructures like hospitals and schools. So that's what the book looks at, is the fact that these infrastructures and these different forms of residential property have increasingly in recent decades, but particularly since the financial crisis, come under the ownership and control of asset managers. And that really wasn't happening to a significant degree before. So that is what I mean by the concept of asset manager society, is a society, ours essentially, in which social life is embedded in these infrastructures, physical infrastructures that are owned by asset managers. And what I do in the book, and this kind of gets back to where your question began, is I distinguish that from what other people have increasingly referred to as asset manager capitalism. And because what they refer to there is essentially not the control of these very socially influential and socially important physical infrastructures, physical assets by asset managers, but rather the control of financial assets by asset managers. So what they're talking about there is when is where asset managers control ownership of growing amounts of financial assets like stocks and bonds. And there the focus is actually typically on a different set of asset managers, because they have different specializations. So there the focus tends to be on the likes of BlackRock and Vanguard and State Street, the so-called big three, who between them own and control on average about 20% of the shares of every single company listed on the stock market, but they tend to control them in a very passive way. So they control them through the so-called index funds, which just hold them because they want to these funds, they essentially replicate the ownership of the big stock market indices in the US, and they own thousands and thousands of shares in these thousands and thousands of companies through these index funds, but they do it very passively. They don't get involved typically in what's going on with those companies. Whereas what I'm talking about in this book is they don't own 5 or 6% each of these companies. They own the assets in their totality. They control the assets. They decide the amount that you pay to rent the housing that you own. They control the amount that you pay in terms of a toll to go on the roads that they own. So they control these assets in their totality, and therefore they control a significant aspect of our lives because our lives are dependent upon these assets. And I'll finish that question by giving you kind of an indication of some of the numbers involved. So Macquarie, the first of those asset managers that I mentioned, it estimates that it owns and controls infrastructures on which around 100 million people around the world rely every day to go about their lives, whether it's telecommunications infrastructures or transport infrastructures or whatever else it might be. So they have a huge effect on our lives without almost all of us even knowing it. So I would guess that 99.9% of those 100 million people have no idea that the infrastructures that they rely upon every day and to whom they make payments are controlled by Macquarie. Most people would have no idea that that's the case.